All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, August 4th of 2022. Thank you for tuning into the stream here today. We have an 8-game baseball slate here tonight. We have a 3-game baseball slate going on later this afternoon. I won't be playing that one. I am diving into that 8-game slate here tonight. We also have our first football game of the season here tonight. At least preseason. The Hall of Fame game is here tonight. As of earlier this morning, it is up in the app. We won't have sims for any preseason games, but it does look like I was wrong about actually what I said yesterday. It does look like we will have the slates up in the app. So if you do have a set of projections handy, or you want to just take a shot at kind of projecting some of these players yourself, it is, I think, a bit of a crapshoot anyway to know exactly, especially some of this for this first season of preseason, who's going to play. Yeah, I would say go for it. Fire away at it. There are, of course, there is a $50K to first contest on DraftKings here for this showdown preseason football game here tonight. That is just what the NFL DFS world is like. It blows my mind every time we have a 50K to first DraftKings baseball slate most nights for games that actually count, for like actually playable slates. And then here comes football, Hall of Fame game, first preseason game of the season. Boom, 50K to first showdown here for people to sweat this game out, though. So anyway, I'm all for it. I'm very, very excited for football season here. And in fact, the one question we have in our queue here for today, we only have one. So if you have questions for me, put them into the queue here now. But the one question we have is about football showdown strategy. So that is actually where we'll start today. But before we dive into that, real quickly, for anybody tuning in for the very first time into Office Hours, welcome. My name is Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim. And on this show, I answer questions from our community about how to use SaberSim to build better DFS lineups. So there are a lot of different ways to get your questions answered on this show. If you are joining me live here, you can answer live or ask live in the YouTube chat. You can also ask live in the Office Hours channel in Slack. And of course, if you catch the recording of this, stumble on the recording or the podcast or anything of that nature, you can always email us, support@sabersim.com. So let's go ahead. Let's get the app pulled up. And I'm over here on baseball right now. But again, the one question we have is about football. So let's go ahead here and start talking about that. It's from Jeremy. Pretty cool, or pretty straightforward question here. Can you walk through your process for NFL Showdown? So let's go dig up an NFL Showdown slate from last year. Maybe we'll go. Oh, there it is. There is the slate here tonight. That is exciting, isn't it? That just feels good. Very, very exciting. We don't have the sims up for week one. Like, true. Actually, really, this shouldn't even be saying week one. This is actually really preseason week one, I guess. Week 0 looks a little funny anyway. Anyway, what I'm trying to say, we don't have the actual slates up here for the regular season just yet. But let's go dig up one here from last year. Maybe. I don't know. What should we pick here? What feels right? How about week 14, right? That seems kind of fun. And we'll go and we'll pick a game out. Looks like right in the middle of December here. Obviously, there are showdown slates for every game of the week in football, but what would be a fun one here? Why not do this Thursday night football here that we had between Pittsburgh and Minnesota? Right. So I'll kind of talk about what I look for here. And I will preface this by saying the same thing that I say pretty much every single time we talk about Showdown, right? If you break down the game dynamics of what we are trying to do in a Showdown contest, right? We have a single game of football here. And we want to figure out what are the possible game outcomes, right? What are the different ways this game could play out? How likely are certain different outcomes to occur? And then what do the DFS lineups look like that are associated with those game outcomes, right? So if we say, hey, like this game is going to end up being, I don't know, 32 to or I don't know, 35 to 28 this percentage of the time. What are the different DFS lineups that look like that, right? That's essentially what we're trying to do. And doing just that is very, very hard by hand or on a traditional optimizer, right? I think humans in general are pretty bad at adequately assessing the true range of outcomes of what's possible. And then I think even from there, you are likely to overestimate what players are likely to be successful, even in certain game scripts. All of that is what is essentially automated from SaberSim, right? We have, like, when we look at any of these players here, so you can say, yeah, so on this particular slate, like, sure, Justin Jefferson was projected for 20.71 fantasy points, but he actually has a range of outcomes associated with that. And this is common, I think, often for typically for your wide receivers, higher variance players, right? Where their most common outcome is actually going to be a lot lower than their average, right? I think it may come to surprise. I think it may come to some people's surprise to see that Justin Jefferson, while he's projected for 21 points, his most common outcome is actually about 11. Right? That's not necessarily intuitive what you might expect. The reason that projection is so much higher is because of this big tail of ceiling outcomes where he's scoring 30, 40, like maybe even the Jamar Chase 50 burger, right? So anyway, when we build lineups with SaberSim, right, we come over here, we set our settings. We are going to get lineups that are basically building an optimal of a single game sim, right? Is this the Dalvin Cook game? I think it is. I remember this game now. I think, yes, indeed. I think it is. Anyway, so we are going to get, this is the one. This was a weird situation. I actually remember this game well. We had the split. I actually talked about this game the very next day on an Office Hours stream. And actually one of the things I talked about on that particular stream here, and still useful here, is the, like, in this particular situation, we essentially split time for Cook and Madison. He was questionable coming in, and it was unclear how much either of these guys was going to play. And one of the things I actually had talked about on that stream, the stream that we did, it was the very next Friday after this game, because if you built lineups like this, and we'll see here in a second, if you built lineups like this, you actually got very little Dalvin Cook, because basically this is almost hedging, right? This is splitting the difference between those two. And one of the things I talked about is to look for situations like this sometimes, and you might as well pick a side, or maybe build some lineups with one projected one way or one projected the other way, but you might as well pick a side here because this doesn't really help anybody as it is. But anyway, that's beside the point. Let's just talk about broader strategy here, right? So let's build some lineups here and just start looking at what these look like, right? So anyway, what SaberSim does is it does a very good job of identifying what the best lineups are to play. And what I like to do is add a little bit of additional value by figuring out what is the field going to do and playing the other side of that, right? How is the field going to think about this game? How can I afford to get a little bit different? And there's a few different ways you can do that. I think one is just the ownership projections, right? I think the ownership projections will do a very good job. In this case, I think we were actually one of the few providers here that actually hedged this at all. Right. I think the public perception as indicated by this ownership projection was definitely that Madison was going to get the run and Dalvin Cook was like basically a decoy for this game. So that's kind of why he was so highly owned. But also the ownership projections, and then also just like the game context, right? The game script itself, right? Looking at the game total and the spread to kind of identify what people think of this game is going to be. So this game, about a 4-point spread here, 44-point total, so probably a lower scoring game. I think at this point in the season, people were kind of aware that the Steelers offense was pretty anemic last year. So what does that mean? I think people are going to probably favor Minnesota stacks a little bit more, playing like a little bit more on the Minnesota side of that game. And I think you're also going to see some more running backs involved in lineups. I think you're going to see some kickers and some defenses here. And let's just actually look at 20 lineups because I think it simplifies it a little bit here. You can do this for 100 lineups or 150 lineups as well. But so how can we get a little bit different? Well, I'll just kind of start testing this out and seeing like, what can we do? Can we vary the game script from what people expect is going to happen here? And one way I might do that is just by starting by saying like, what happens if we just X out the Minnesota stacks? And let's assume that Pittsburgh wins this game, right? And let's go one step further here and let's X out some Vikings players from the captain spot as well, and say we want a Steelers captain, and we want a Steelers lineup, right? And we can keep going further, right? What kind of lineups are we getting here now? Double kicker lineup, right? Again, low score, right? So I think those are going to be popular constructions. So I might start Xing out defenses, which I don't like to play a ton anyway, and kickers, right? Let's play that this game actually goes off a little bit more. And then we get this message, right? What is this message saying? This message is saying, hey, we don't have lineups that look like what you are asking us to do in the pool here anymore. And this to me is a sign that I've done too much. So let's back off this a little bit here instead, right? Let's reset everything, get back to where we were before, and try a different angle. So what I'm going to try this time instead of trying to be really aggressive there, let's start by trying to X out some of these. I think when you have a lower total game, you really start to see people really favor some of those pitchers pitchers, man, I'm all messed up. Kickers and defenses, right? And you can see even in our sims, right? Those are two pretty popular plays. I'm going to X them out because I want to play an angle that there is so much scoring here that isn't the way that the game plays out. That isn't the optimal path for the game here. So I'm going to X these guys out here. Cool. And then the other thing I might start to do here is just kind of look. I'll also keep an eye out. You know, football is interesting, and I'm a little out of practice on it too, just because one thing you have to get yourself used to again is how big these contests are going to be. And you know, sometimes it can be the D.D. Westbrook captain or the Smith Marset captain that ends up. You know, all that person needs to do in that position to be profitable there is score a touchdown. But I might also remove some lower projected. Even CJ Ham was kind of interesting, right? With the uncertainty of this game at the running back position, I can see why he's getting some captain love here, but I might start Xing out some of those guys as well here to kind of clean up this captain pool and make sure that I'm playing some like real upside guys there. Another thing like just worth noting here is like on a slate with a really high total, the quarterbacks might be really popular, right? Kirk Cousins might be a really popular captain if this had a much higher total. Ben Roethlisberger might have been a more popular captain if this game had a higher total. Here, they're not, right? So I'm okay playing them here, but that's one thing to look at too is your quarterbacks as well. So we've kind of cleaned up the captain pool a little bit here. We've removed defenses and kickers from our overall pool. Now let's try going back to that construction a little bit more as well. And let's at least get rid of Minnesota 4 stacks, right? And we're going to say we're at least going to play if we play Minnesota stacks, we're playing them in a way that's a balanced lineup. Otherwise, we're going to play lineups that are overweight to Pittsburgh, right? And now I might be feeling kind of good about how maybe this is coming together, right? I'll go back through and double check here again and make sure that I'm happy with this. I could also even go a little bit further again and try to see if we can maybe play some more focused Pittsburgh captains, right? And hope that the upside is on a Steeler here. And I'm basically testing the pool of 500 to see what it is flexible to. How can I get different in a way that where there are still lineups and sims that support that outcome, but in a way that I don't think the field is going to actually truly appreciate, right? That's kind of the way I'm thinking about it. The first time we did this just a minute ago, we pushed the sims in a direction that wasn't really viable, right? We did too much. This time around, I feel a little bit better about this. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about, right? I'm not worrying too much about individual lineup construction, to be honest. I let the sims handle that, right? Because I know if I'm seeing a lineup over here, it means that lineup is optimal for at least one simulation, right? Which is kind of all I need to know that lineup's decent. I can do a little bit of selection here on my end in the exposures to get a little different from the field, but it's good enough for me to know that the sim is supporting that lineup for me to be willing to play it there. So yeah, man, Dalvin Cook went for 38.2. I remember this slate so well now at this point. This was a fun one. Ben Roethlisberger had 43 in the captain spot. So anyway, that is kind of how I'm thinking about it, right? Is let the sims handle the ranges of outcomes and the lineups associated with them. What I'm going to handle is like providing that kind of human element of, hey, here's how I don't know, like here's what I think people are going to underappreciate, right? This is what I think people are going to do wrong. So Metal Alloy brings up a good point. He says, love the new update I saw on the Run Pure show, which is where I just was. You can swap and build lineups. That is a great update. Yeah. So for those that don't already know, you now have the ability to edit lineups here in the app, right? So you can pick any of these lineups. And I think people are going to love this for football, right? You come over here and you're like, hey, I love this lineup. all except for the fact that it's Najee Harris captain and Benny Snell here. I'm fine. Maybe you say I'm fine punting to like basically anybody else, right? Any other like random guy. Maybe you want to take a stab on Smith Marset or something like that, right? And now you can save that lineup and lock it in and play this version of that lineup instead, right? Really cool. Really cool stuff. I think people are going to love that for football. I'm very excited as well to make some little changes and things like that as we get into football season here, especially for Showdown. I think for Showdown, sometimes you see that lineup where it is just like, hey, man, if that one player like says two players were kind of just a little bit different, I would dig this lineup a little bit more. So cool. But with that is the only other question I had in the queue here for me today. Anybody else have any other questions for me here? I would love to say that we could start looking at, I'm so very, very excited to start looking at some slates for this year. I wonder if we even have the actual slate loaded in the app, like for week one, just because it'd be fun to just kind of start seeing what some builds are looking like, what things are how things are coming together a little bit. But I don't think, we have. Okay, so it looks like we're picking up. Oh no, this is something else. We're not there yet. So very excited about football. I will say one thing to look forward to coming up here in the near future on the SaberSim side. Max and I are planning on doing some kind of best ball type stream here in the near future. We don't strictly support best ball in the app. There's not really any SaberSim best ball product, but he's been grinding out some best ball drafts. I've been grinding out some best ball drafts. I know probably many of you listening along have been as well. So we are working on getting that scheduled right now. A good time for us to we'll probably do it a little bit later in the day, probably not in the main part of the day like these shows are. Probably be a little bit more of a casual kind of vibe, answer some questions, talk a little best ball strategy, maybe do a best ball draft here live on stream as well. I don't know about you guys, but I have been like super addicted to best ball all summer, basically, especially starting in July. So if you guys have been playing, I know a few of you out there have been asking for that kind of content. So I think it'll be fun. Again, there's no best ball product at the moment within SaberSim. There's not even really a lot of best ball products out there, period. But I think a lot of the concepts that you would learn from building DFS lineups for NFL in the app, you can apply to best ball drafts, right? Correlation has value. There's a value in balancing diversification versus upside. I think to some extent, ownership, even like comes into play a little bit as well there. So, anyway, Eamon said, I'm gonna just address the question here, and just avoid getting into anything else here. But in terms of what does it mean to hedge a contest here, basically, hedging your bets, right, would be kind of like basically taking I guess a hedge in like a traditional sports betting sense would be, at least the way I've often heard it applied is once you have like locked in or have an opportunity to lock in a portion of profit on a bet, you can take the other side to basically, you can take the other side of a bet to basically guarantee that you get that profit, right? So like, let's say you bet the Bills to win the Super Bowl right now, and they're like probably, I don't even know what they are, plus 800 maybe would be like a guess, right? And then you get to the Super Bowl in February, and it's the Bills versus the Rams, right? Just as an example. You would then probably be able, there would be a bet that you could make mathematically on the Rams where you were locking in profit, right? It wouldn't be your maximum profit. If the Bills won, the maximum profit approach would have been to have just stayed with it. But if the Rams win, you lose the Bills bet, but you had a bet on the Rams that kind of balances out, right? So you can kind of think about this somewhat in a similar way for DFS, right? That's at least kind of what Tim in chat was talking about, right? So, if you are, let's just build some lineups here for tonight's slate, right? So let's say you're playing 20 lineups. And based on the builds I was running earlier, it seems like we really like Jeffrey Springs. I think everybody's going to like Jeffrey Springs here tonight. A way to hedge that would basically be to get some exposure to Tigers bats, where you're basically saying, hey, like I'm pretty exposed to Jeffrey Springs in the event that there's a downside outcome here or a floor outcome. What's the best way that I can have the other side of that? Now, it's not strictly a true hedge in the same way what I talked about before was, because you're not locking in a profit here. You're not guaranteeing a profit. You're just really, I think actually a better way of describing this is it's really just diversification, right? It's really just a diversification thing, right? Like you're not actually doing a true hedge. You're just getting exposure to a wider variety of teams, I think is actually a better way to say it, right? So yes, again, right? Yes, we like Jeffrey Springs here tonight, projected as maybe the best pitcher on the slate, 7,100. I think he's going to be very popular. How do we hedge that, right? One way to do that would be to find a way to get a little exposure to Detroit. And maybe in this case, it's just 10%, right? You don't even need to, it doesn't even need to be a ton, right? So now we have a handful of lineups here where we can basically play the other side of that game, right? So a good example yesterday would have been like Mariner stacks, right? For the Garrett Cole blow up. Right, you get to some Mariner stacks. You're kind of playing, and I think there is some value to this as a way of basically maximizing or maintaining a very high expected value while limiting your potential worst case scenario downside. There's been a lot of discussion about this, like these kinds of concepts on like lulls recently. If you guys listen to lulls, I know like Brian's been talking a lot about negatively correlating your lineups within a portfolio, not like negatively correlating a lineup, but taking lineups and like playing a portfolio of lineups that are somewhat negatively correlated to one another or as diversified as possible, especially in a sport like baseball where there is a enormous number of lineups that are probably all have a similar number, all have a similar expected value, right? That you can basically sacrifice negligible or zero expected value and diversify significantly. Now, in practice, right? Like it's not necessarily like always easy to do that, and it doesn't always necessarily like create the best sweat overall. Like if you are the type of DFS player that wants to pick your guys and kind of like have a rooting interest across the board, I think that can be difficult to do. But I do think there's a pretty strong argument. Again, I don't think I would call it hedging, but to diversify in that way. And I've actually been trying to incorporate a little bit of that into my process as well. I think this stack pool exposures really does help for that somewhat, right? I think it can remind you of somewhat of like, even if you're not running a true research build, I think this stack pool, this column can help you identify just like the probability of success for these different players. We were talking about that yesterday, right? How much should I diversify if I'm going to diversify? Where's pool? Oh no, let's see here. Right. I think this can kind of help, right? Like if you're just looking at this and you're like, man, that seems like a lot of Jeffrey Springs exposure. Do I really want that much? Like this can help remind you like, hey, it's only 50% of the lineups in your pool that have Springs, right? If you want to, you can probably diversify that without getting far away for without getting far away from your original expected value, and then just diversify a little more and reduce your risk. So Neil, 8.3 exposures for everyone. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the thing. It's like if you try to just match all of your exposures to your pool exposures, you'll eventually it just won't work because there's not enough combinations, right? So you do have to take like some stands here. And just because as your number of lineups that you are playing gets smaller, the number of discrete exposures that you can even mathematically hit gets lower. You also have to think about it that way as well, right? Like we can only get to exposures in multiples of 5 here, and there's only 500 lineups in the pool, so that's something to think about there as well. But I do think that's a direction that things are moving a little bit, and we're actually already talking about that on our end of stuff we can implement into the app to kind of basically like address that. And right now when you're using SaberSim, lineup 2 doesn't care what lineup 1 is, right? It's just part of the way that the app works, right? Like this lineup is just the second best lineup that meets all of your exposures here after this one. This was the first one, and this is the second one. But in practice, from your portfolio, from like trying to maximize your upside, trying to maximize your profit with minimal risk, this lineup does care what this lineup is, right? If you could make this lineup be the exact same expected value of this lineup and have 0 shared players in common, it would be to your benefit to do so, because you are then like completely uncorrelating those lineups. And in fact, if you could negatively correlate those lineups, it would probably be even better. The problem is actually doing so in a way that doesn't sacrifice a ton of EV, right? Because there is, especially as you add more and more lineups, you do eventually run into a situation where you are sacrificing EV. So anyway, all of this to say, I think, what are we even talking about here? I'm on like a rant now. All of this to say, I do think there is some argument to like thinking about things in that way, even if they aren't mathematical hedges necessarily. So, but anyway, what else? What other questions do we have here for today? Any other questions for me? Let's take a look. All right. A couple questions trickling in Slack here. Troubles has a question about pitchers on a research build. Let's take a look. Love me a research build. We haven't done one yet. 26 minutes into the stream and we haven't done a research build. That's got to be some kind of record, right? Let's do it here. 1500, 0. We'll let this build. And I'll use the opportunity, as always, to try to help catch anybody up that's watching me do this for the first time. Like, whoa, why did that guy just change all those settings? I never do that. What this is, I call this a research build. We basically turn all the sliders to 0, except for sim precision, which we turn to 10. And the point of this is to basically sim the slate. We're essentially simming the slate out with a single game simulation for every game 1,500 times. And it'll kind of roughly let you approximate how likely certain players are to be optimal. Like literally in the optimal player in that position for that lineup. And I think it's a useful way to start seeing how where ownership inefficiencies are, right? Where some opportunities to take some stands are. So last night I ran this and I was so under the field on Padres. My research build took me in a direction of basically, I had so many Brewer stacks who were like the next best team. I according to my research build, they seemed like slightly overowned, but generally pretty efficient. And the Padres were just massively overowned, which worked out okay. I thought it was going to work out better. I was definitely feeling good after the first game, but then the Padres put up like 10 runs or whatever. So it kind of broke down from there. But let's talk about this. Let's see what we are seeing in our research build here, right? So we're comparing exposure, which in this case is the probability of the player being in the optimal lineup, to their ownership projection, and seeing what we see. It is a really ugly pitching slate. Honestly, first thing that jumps out to me here is that I don't think we're going to be able to find a ton of leverage on this particular slate on pitching, right? It just doesn't seem like ownership is that inefficient. The ownership will dial in and actually probably become less efficient throughout the day, weirdly, right? Our ownership here, like right now, is probably based a little bit more on our projections. And as other sources update throughout the day and we actually get an idea of what the field is likely to do, these numbers will get more accurate, but I would say less efficient compared to our SaberSim numbers. So in other words, you'll probably see bigger, better opportunities to take stands as throughout the day. But for right now, doesn't look like there's a ton of great options, right? Jeffrey Springs even looks actually like a pretty efficient play, right? Like, yes, there's a 5% inefficiency here, but there's also some error to these, right? Like if this number was actually 28, then all of a sudden your ownership edge there is disappearing. I think there's an interesting angle here if people start getting attached to Justin Verlander, which I think they could. It seems like he is one of the less efficiently owned pitchers here tonight. So that might be a way to get a little bit different here on tonight's slate. Our sims are basically saying playing Verlander is basically the same as playing Carrasco or Manoah, and the ownership does not agree. So that does seem like an opportunity here. So I think that's probably the angle that I would take here. So I would say, honestly, probably just like being under on Verlander is how I would kind of think about approaching this, or at most even with the field. I'd probably be a little bit cautious of Jeffrey Springs, just because I also do think this number is going to be. I think one thing that can be useful to think about on your research builds is, if you're wrong, what direction are you going to be wrong in? Which does require a little bit of intuition and like a little bit of experience playing the sport. But 7,100 projected pitcher that I think is going to just project very well in all projection models tonight. I think this number is not going to get any lower than this. I think this number could be higher than this. So I would probably proceed with caution there a little bit as well. It might be that a lot of the leverage opportunities are on the bats here tonight instead. So we'll go take a look there and see. Honestly, not a ton here as well either. Not a lot of inefficient ownership. Let's just see how the top overall bats look. So Philly, Tampa Bay, Boston, Houston, which all kind of the usual suspects, makes a lot of sense here. I mean, it does look like maybe you're getting an opportunity to fade a particularly, or be under on a particularly chalky Kyle Schwarber here. But it just doesn't look like ownership is that inefficient. I would probably say if people are going to rush to play Phillies and Tampa Bay and Houston and Boston, I might see just like what other ways I can get a little bit different there. Like how can I get exposures to some other teams? But honestly, a slate where there's not, at least at the moment, I think a ton of ownership inefficiency, and that's okay. Sometimes that happens. So let's actually talk about like applying this now. And let's do it for a 150. We haven't done 150 max in a while here on stream. So we'll just use the default settings. This is like, maybe you're playing the mini max or something like that, right? And one thing I'm going to do here, because I know I'm going to be editing exposures, is I'm going to be increasing my pool size to 1,500, so I have more lineups to play with, right? So I'm going to just build these now, and we'll take what we just saw in our research build, and we'll try to apply some concepts here and see what we're thinking. So Willie said, I just did a 20 max yesterday and had 19 Milwaukee stacks and one a Dodger stack. Glad to know you got a Milwaukee too. I had so much Milwaukee. It's absurd. I had a 92% Milwaukee stacks in 150 lineups. I probably should have diversified, to be honest. It was probably a little extreme, but that was just where my process was taking me. So, and Benny Hanna said, saw a mix of Milwaukee and Pittsburgh game stacks too, Jordan. Yeah, I had a lot of Pittsburgh as well. And then question, what is the relationship between the percentile and sim precision, if any? Yeah, so they are kind of related here. So the percentiles basically look at the full range of outcomes and then basically kind of create breakpoints for certain probabilities. So the 95th percentile is basically that's the I think the best way of describing it is 95% of the sim outcomes are below that number, right? Only 5% are above it. So it's basically like they only meet or exceed that point projection in 5% of the time, right? The 50th percentile would be like the middle outcome. Half of the sims are above that, half of the sims are below that, right? So the percentiles kind of help you see breakpoints and visualize probabilities, or think about probabilities within the full range of outcomes of the sims. The sim precision slider here is it also interacts with the sims, but what this is basically saying is, for a given lineup, how many sims is that lineup going to be based on? So by the default value for tonight for a 150 max is 7, which means 11 simulations per lineup. So for every lineup, we pull 11 random sims out of our database of thousands of sims for each game, right? And this is 11 sims per game. So it's 11 sims per game. We set the player projections to the average from those 11 sims, and then use that projections to build just that lineup. And then we get a different set of 11 sims for the next lineup, right? So they both kind of, I wouldn't say they're necessarily like related, but they're both kind of ways of interacting with the simulation. So, but good question there. Let's keep it going here. We'll kind of back up, I guess, to this question here and talk about like so what do we do with this information now? So again, the two numbers that I think are really most useful for me when deciding where I want to end up on players is the ownership projection and now this new pool, right? So again, let's start with Verlander. I think that's a more interesting case here. So if we think that the field's going to roster him at 30%. It is interesting. We have 38% in our pool. But just considering that this is like one of the main inefficiencies that it seems like we're going to get on tonight's slate, I think I'm going to start with at least max even with the field here. And now Jeffrey Springs, interesting example as well here. I think what I'm going to do, since it doesn't seem like it's the most inefficient ownership here, I think I'm going to just be even with our pool, right? I'm going to just say, you know what, the probability of being in any lineup of our pool, that's where I'm going to stay with Jeffrey Springs. So I'm kind of capping there. I'm not taking like extreme stance on either of those guys, I don't think. One other player that did show up, and I didn't mention it, but I saw his name here down at the bottom. Jose Quintana does look like that he does have some inefficient ownership here coming his way. 21%, not to me like a guy that really stands out on this particular slate. We're coming in under the field already, which looks pretty good, but I might actually just keep that. I might just set that to 10 so we don't actually end up over the field on him at some point as we're making other changes. So, and then this is pushing us in a direction. Carlos Carrasco, Alek Manoah, Nick Pivetta, Syndergaard, right? Some of these other guys, I think that all kind of makes sense as the logical pivots there. Let's go over to the team stacks here, and we'll do this on the stack side because I know people are always interested to see this on the stack side. So again, the teams that I think are kind of like riskier here, or that just like slightly overowned. This, if I could describe this slate in a word, it's flat. Right. It seems like it's kind of flat on pitchers. It seems like it's kind of flat on stacks. I don't think there's like a ton of like, you got to play this guy. And it doesn't seem like ownership's getting out of hand anywhere. So I'm just going to try to get a little bit different and diversify and avoid a situation where I'm like going really hard on one team or another, or playing a team that is getting some more of that ownership. So I might cap Boston to around my pool exposure here as well as Tampa Bay, right? Around maybe 25%. I'm going to just set Houston here to 22%, just so I don't get over on them as well. And then Philly, I'm going to set to 15%, which is around my stack exposure. And that's just going to give me an opportunity to get to some different teams here, right? We're getting a little bit more White Sox all of a sudden. We're getting to some Cubs stacks. We're getting to some Washington stacks. We're not like, I think this is actually a good opportunity. This is a good build for us to have done today, because sometimes I think in the research build, I give this impression that I look at it and I just like start Xing out teams and Xing out teams and Xing out teams. And that might be true if I was playing 1 or 3 or even 20 lineups, but on 150, I like to spread out a little bit more. So this is a kind of a good way to do it. The one other thing I might do here before I kind of call this build complete is I might go back to that research build one more time and look to see, are there any teams that I actually think I like specifically want to get to, right? Are there any teams that actually have some positive leverage, or it seems like are being unappreciated by the field? And given the context of the rest of the slate, I don't think there are going to be any, but we'll take a quick look. A lot of times I'll apply a little intuition here as well. Some of the teams I like to look for when I'm doing this, if I'm looking for a reason to play a team, I like good teams against good pitchers, right? I also like bad teams against bad pitchers, right? So if there's a good pitcher that's chalky pitching into a good team, I kind of like getting a little exposure to the other side of that. I'm willing to play that. So like yesterday's a good example where like Seattle, I think is like that's a pretty good lineup. It's a pretty good team. It's a team I'm comfortable stacking on most nights. Into Garrett Cole, like I probably should have gotten a little Seattle. I didn't. But the main slate last night, the A's are not a good team, right? Against Ohtani. That doesn't mean the A's are a bad team to stack. It doesn't mean you can't stack them, but I'm just a little less excited about it. Today, for example, almost all the good pitchers are playing good teams, right? Like the Guardians at least have a pretty decent lineup. The Twins are a good hitting lineup. The Braves are a good hitting lineup. And then you have Springs, who's like the chalkiest one of them all, up against the Tigers. I think it kind of depends a little bit on how good you think Jeffrey Springs is, but I'm not completely bought in at the moment that that's like an elite pitcher. So I'm probably like, I would be willing to find reasons to play Tiger stacks as well. So if we look through this, right, that's kind of, I wanted to preface that because all of a sudden you see there's a little bit of positive leverage on the Braves, the Twins, the Guardians, the Tigers, right? Like all of the teams that I think there are reasons to play, there is some positive leverage on. So I might go back here now and then use this as a reason to get a little bit exposure to some of these other teams. How much exposure? Well, I will let the stack pool help guide me, right? Because this is saying like we're actually getting 10%. We're already over on Detroit. We're getting 10% Detroit, right? But there's 3.5% in our pool. Let's look for some of these other. Atlanta, here's a good example, right? Like how much Atlanta do we want to get? Well, there's 9% of our entire pool of lineups have an Atlanta stack in there. Clearly there's some viability there, even if they're not popping up as the top overall team, right? Let's get some Brave stacks. Twins, here's a counter example, right? Twins and Guardians, right? How much Twins and Guardians can we really get here? Well, not a whole lot, right? Like you guys can't see this. Sorry. I'm down here at the very bottom. Guardians and Twins, right? We're getting 2% of each of them. So I might like say like, hey, let's get like a little bit of these teams, right? Like let's get a little bit diversity here. And get some exposure to these guys, but I'm not going to go crazy there. And this is also kind of what I was referring to before, right? Where you have more like 2% exposure actually means something when you're playing 150 lineups, right? Like you can actually, that has a legitimate effect, right? So all of a sudden we're talking about a pool of lineups that I like probably would feel pretty good about, right? We didn't do anything too crazy here. We capped some pitchers that we think maybe look a little inefficiently owned. We are maybe going out and getting exposure. We're capping exposure to a few team stacks that look like maybe a little chalky. We're getting a little bit of exposure to some teams that I think are going to go underappreciated. I think the Braves really stand out as a team that it just seems like it's a good opportunity to get some Braves exposure here tonight. It doesn't seem like they're going to be a very popular play to me. And I'm also not very opinionated about what type of stack I get with these guys either. So. Like if I bump up the Braves to 10% and almost every single one of those is a Braves 2 stack, or the majority of them are 2 or 3 stacks, I'm fine with that. To me, that's SaberSim filling in the gaps. To me, that's SaberSim saying, okay, you want to stack this team, you want to get a little exposure there. Here's a good way to do it. So I have no problem doing that. So. All right, cool. There was another question here. Nipsey. Had said, hey, Jordan, I went through the chaos of late swapping last night. Is there any way to adjust team exposures from games that haven't started during the late swap process? Yes, there is. So it's kind of complicated, right? But so at the moment, the only way to set team stack exposures in SaberSim is within a build. But you can send those team stack exposures back to the projections tab. And even though you won't be able to see them there, they will work for another build. So like, let's say we worked really hard on these team stack exposures and we want to make sure we have them throughout the rest of the slate. And then we need to late swap for some reason, right? We need to actually run a late swap build. We can actually go back to this build. Let's actually first, let me get an entries file up here so I can actually put these lineups in. Okay. Okay, so we'll just do that. Okay, so now we have lineups. Let's do this real quick too. Okay. So now let's say for some reason we actually have to late swap, right? So we have this entries file. So we can actually send these exposures that we made back to the home screen. And it's going to say, this is like a very important message. It's going to say you're sending team game and stack exposures to the home screen where they can't be changed. These exposures will apply to upcoming builds, but you can't see them on the projections tab, right? It's just a weird quirk on the way the app is right now. But if we send these home and then we went and did a late swap, right? So now it's lock, right? Now it's a late swap build. The late swap here will still account for those team stack exposures from the original build because we sent them back to the projections tab. So that's how you do it. In the future, there'll be a dashboard where you can just edit them. That's what we're working on right now, actually. But right now, you have to send them from an old existing build to get them there. So Art Vandelay, that's a funny name, said, usually for most slates, I will increase or decrease at least 2 players projection by around 10%. Maybe it depends on slate size and other factors. But do you think it's unwise to say 5 or 10 players projections? If I adjust too many players, I'm surely doing more harm than good for my lineups. Is there a way to know how much is too much? I would actually say if you are sticking to 10% adjustments, I would adjust essentially to your heart's content. So one thing real quick, I should just mention it. Since we saw that message, you can't meet the exact requested exposures. You should be aware in a late swap build, exposures are a little bit more of like guidelines, just because we're not building a full pool of lineups. We're just building the exact 150 you need. You need to be willing to be a little bit more flexible with your exposures in late swap builds. So quickly wanted to just touch on that, but let's come back here. Yeah. So anyway, if you're doing like, if you're sticking to 10% adjustments, I would go crazy. I would adjust to your heart's content. I think it's unlikely that you like really just break something on a 10% player adjustment. Now, I mean, there's no sense in adjusting a player without any cause whatsoever, right? I wouldn't adjust every player 10% up or down just to say you did. But if you are opinionated about 10 different players, 20 different players, 30 different players, I would adjust. I would make adjustments, right? If you're opinionated about every pitcher in the pool, for example, right, and you want to adjust all these guys, I would go for it. The nice thing about staying within 10% is SaberSim is not perfect, but it's a very good baseball simulator, baseball projection model, right? It's very, very accurate. Like we've back tested it in past seasons heavily and feel very confident about it. So we can be wrong sometimes, but I think it's unlikely that we're ever like significantly out of line on a player. So when you're making a 10% adjustment, it kind of, it helps you stay in frame a little bit. And it helps you do things like, it helps you assess fragility, I think is actually a really good way of looking at it, right? Like you may say, man, I'm getting so much Jeffrey Springs here tonight. Like, do I really want to do that? Is that really the direction I want to play? Right. Adjusting Jeffrey Springs by a 1.8 points, which is 10% of his original projection here, which would take him down to about 17 points. You're still within like a reasonable error band of the original projection. And then you can see what impact that has on your build. And actually, I did this experiment on the Run Pure stream before we went live here. And what I found is actually that this projection is very fragile tonight, right? As this projection drops, you start getting a lot less springs really fast. So it is an interesting angle here of saying like, well, if the SaberSim model is actually off just by 10% in to the downside, suddenly you get like 10% of him, 15% of him instead of 100%. So same thing, Verlander would be another interesting example. Maybe you take the other side of this and you say, I find it hard to believe that Verlander is like in line with all four of these guys, right? I mean, to me, I'm not saying that this is necessarily how I think, but I'm kind of proposing an angle, I guess. Maybe the angle is that like Verlander is a tier above, right? And to really kind of deserve being that tier above, he deserves a bump of, I'm going to just say, to 20.5 points, right? That's about 10% again, right? Now he kind of stands out in a tier. And then you could run another build here. And actually, let me real quickly. I want to reset player projections and exposures and stack exposures and everything. So let's do that again real quick, because I don't want those exposures that we sent home affecting this, right? So maybe you do that. And now you can run another build, and we'll just do 20 this time and see what the impact of that is. And that's just with a 10% adjustment, right? Like that's not an enormous adjustment for these guys. So yeah, I would say no problems there. But let's run this build and see. But give this a second to build. So Patrick says, when you attend a Coors game, do you like to stack the game for fun? I feel like that's one of the unwritten rules of DFS. You have to. You got to do it. First of all, if you're going out, for me, don't do the whole process. Don't do the whole. I've had way too many times where I'm going out and I'm like, well, I'm not leaving till like lock is at 5 o'clock my time. I'm not leaving till 6. I'll just play DFS and it's just not worth it, right? Like it really isn't. You're worrying about late swapping, especially during NBA season, whatever. But single bullet, couple lineups, why not? If you're going to the game, you have to stack the game. Those are the rules. You'll feel dumb. Worst thing, so there was a game last year I went to, and it was like Reds were in town or something like that. We got tickets for like $6, something like that. Not very expensive seats. And I played 150 lineups, and I was like worrying about starting confirmed lineups when I'm like at the game, and I was like, this is dumb. I don't know why I did this. And two, I faded Coors, the Galaxy brain, like I am. I was like, oh, Coors is chalky. I'm gonna fade it. And the game went off for like, it was like 12-9. And I was like sitting there like such a nerd rooting for the game to like go under the implied total at the game. It's not worth it. So if you're going out, first of all, my recommendation, take it easy on the DFS, right? Just enjoy your night out. And then two, stack the game if you're going to the game. It's the rules. Those are the rules. And I'll just say that for any sport. Like, I know there's not really a real good argument to game stack in basketball or something like that, but forget it, right? If I'm going to the game, I'm stacking the game. At least one player on the other side too. Might as well, right? So anyway, let's look at this build real quick. So what happened here, right? Look at this. I mean, this is crazy. Like this isn't always the case. You will run into situations where player projections are anti-fragile, right? Where you adjust them significantly and nothing changes. 10% boost to Verlander, clearly the best play on the slate. 10% drop to Jeffrey Springs, 10% ownership, right? And now some of that is because of the ownership, right? Like this ownership projection was generated based on his higher projection. So we're almost double counting here because we've dropped his projection, but we're still counting his ownership as if it was this. So like something to be aware of. And also actually another thing to be aware of, this went down. At the start of the show, this was at 30, right? And I said I thought it was going to go up from there. It's actually gone down from there. So something to keep an eye out. But anyway, it just goes to show you like the little projection updates can have a big impact. So, all right. Any other questions here for me on today's stream? How about 10 or so-ish minutes left here for today? It is certainly a bit of an ugly slate here tonight, I think. Flat feels like that perfect word. Not the best pitching slate, not the best like hitting slate either. But the prizes are the same. So sometimes the ugly slates are the ones that you really want to play the most because they're ugly to everybody. But I'm interested to see as well. Like it doesn't seem. I'm curious just kind of how ownership's going to fall here tonight because it seems like you're going to be able to get some good teams pretty easily. Let's see what Vegas thinks. It seems like you're going to be able to stack some like pretty good teams in some decent spots with very little ownership tonight, right? Like if the field really does think that it's like it's all in Phillies, Rays, Red Sox. I don't know. Seems like playing like Cardinals or White Sox is just like pretty easy, right? All right. Well, this dashboard's not working. So something to keep an eye on. That would be one other angle to look at. But I think it also just depends on how the ownership kind of all plays out. So Patrick said, how's golf? I don't really know. I got to go back and look at my lineups. I know I had like 60% Sung Jae. So when I woke up, I was feeling pretty good. It was like a couple hours ago even. I was feeling pretty good. I didn't wake up a couple hours ago, but when I woke up and a couple hours ago, I was still feeling good. I don't know how he ended up finishing the round. So I have a lot of Sung Jae. I have a lot of Shane Lowry. And I have a lot of those guys together. So a lot of my lineups also have a lot of like lower salary 7K, 6K kind of golfers. I did kind of a similar build strategy that I've done the last few weeks, where I would say I'm pretty light on just like the 8K and 9K range overall. And a lot of my lineups are 2 10K golfers and then filled in with 7K and 6K guys. I felt like for the last few weeks that we've kind of played the same event from a game theory angle, like 3 times in a row, where it's like, I feel like there's a good 10K range and then like a huge tier gap and then this 9K range, but everybody wants to play all these 9K golfers. I faded, I was pretty heavy on some of my stands on some of the chalkier golfers this week. Like I'm always on Siwoo Kim. I'm off him this week. I don't like playing a chalky Siwoo. I haven't really bought in on the Tom Kim hype yet either. Again, it's just like I think he's a great prospect. I think he's going to be. I think he's especially a good nab for the PGA Tour. But it just seems like it seems like he's getting a little bit chalkier than his chances of success. Really, there was last week he was so close to missing the cut, and then he like went nuts on the weekend. And had a couple really good rounds on the weekend, but he was very, very close, very live to miss the cut, and I was kind of rooting for it last week. So. I don't really know how that all kind of shakes out. I'll have to go check and see how I'm doing. But this always kind of feels like sort of the last, like, I don't know, golf DFS gets a little weird as we go into the playoffs from here on out until the season restart in like September or whenever it is. And then the early like fall ball season stuff is, I don't know. Sometimes especially with football starting, sometimes I'm not as focused on playing golf DFS. So probably some of the maybe we'll see. We'll see how it all shakes out. But probably some of the last couple like events that I'll be really focused on and like really playing a lot of for a bit here. So, but Patrick asks a good question. Does Aaron Judge make a big difference to lineups if he's ruled out? Same things for a superstar player like Byron Buxton. Yeah, I mean, I think he does. I actually have a video up on our YouTube channel. It's a really good one. Biased take. Excellent video. 10 out of 10. You guys should all go watch it. How to late swap an MLB DFS. This one, 12 minutes long. And one of the things I talk about in this video here is categorizing news in baseball as low impact or high impact. And one of the things that I think kind of qualifies something as a high impact change is like a key fundamental player, like the best player on the team getting ruled out for that team, especially when it's combined with having a lot of exposure to that team, right? So like if you're let's try to think. I mean, the Phillies are fine, right? Like if you're playing a lot of Philly stacks tonight and you're like, hey, yeah, I'm eating the chalk, I'm in, and then Kyle Schwarber like gets scratched, right? I mean, that has an impact on the way that they're projected, right? And now it's not necessarily true that any given hitter is the same impact, right? In fact, probably the vast majority of hitters on a slate don't impact the team in that way, where they don't radically change the way that they're projected compared to the rest of the teams. But I think Schwarber getting ruled out could move the total for the Phillies. So I think it's a higher impact change. So in that case, when that happens, and again, this is, I talk about all this and I demo it live or not live. I demo it in this video. But in that case, I'm more likely to use the late swap tool, which rebuilds those lineups instead of just quick swapping that player out. Mostly just because I want to give the builder a chance to like check and basically say, hey, do you still want to play these Philly stacks without Schwarber? Yes or no? And make a decision from there. So with all that said, right, that's assuming that happens after lock, and I guess this is the first game on the slate, so that's not really a good example. If that news breaks before the lock, I'll just rebuild pretty much everything, like for the most part, as long as I have time, right? Like that's mostly more about like late scratches and things like that. But good question. Okay, cool. I think we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. This is the last stream of the week. I will be gone tomorrow, sadly. So I will be right back here next week on Monday, 2:00 Eastern, once again. So enjoy the 8-game slate here tonight. Enjoy your Friday and your weekends. Quick note here on our way out, Behind the Sims. There will be a new episode coming out here by the end of the day today. I'm actually heading off to record that here in the next half hour or so with the guys here. So if you've been listening along to the Behind the Sims podcast, specifically the series that we're doing right now about our slider back testing, expect a new episode here out before the end of the day today. So in the meantime, take care, and I will see you all on Monday of next week. See ya.